Chapter 13. So we rode into camp, and my lord shouted hurrah as if this battle had been his dearest wish. In a great iron clangor our folk went to their stations. Let me describe our situation more fully. As a minor base, Gantarath was not built to withstand the most powerful forces of war. The lesser portion, which we occupied, consisted of several low masonry buildings arranged in a circle. Outside that circle were the armored emplacements of the fire bombards, but these, being meant only to shoot upward at skycraft, were useless to us. Underground was a warren of rooms and passages. There we put our children, aged, prisoners, and cattle in charge of a few armed serfs. Such older people, or others not fit for combat, as were spry enough, waited near the middle of the buildings, prepared to carry off the wounded, fetch beer, and otherwise aid the fighting line. This line stood on the side facing the Wurzgor camp, just within the low earthen wall erected during the night. Their pikes, bills, and axes were reinforced at intervals by squads of bowmen. The cavalry poised at either wing. Behind them were the younger women and certain untrained men who shared out our all too few pellet weapons. The force screen made fire guns useless. Around us shimmered the pale heat lightning of that shield. Behind us rose the ancient forest. Before us, bluish grass rippled down the valley. Isolated trees sawed, and clouds walked above the distant hills. It all had the eerie loveliness of a landscape in fairy. Preparing bandages with the above-ground non-combatants, I wondered why there must be hatred and killing in so sweet a realm. Flying craft thundered skyward and out of sight from the Wurzgor camp. Our gunners dropped a few ere they were all gone. A number remained on the ground, held in reserve. They included some of the very largest transport ships. At the moment, however, my chief interest was the ground. Wurzgoriks streamed forth, armed with long-barreled pellet weapons, and in well-ordered squads. They did not advance in close ranks, but scattered as much as possible. Some of our folk let out a cheer at this, but I knew it must be their ordinary ground-fighting tactics. When one has deadly rapid-fire guns, one does not tack in solid masses. Rather, one employs devices to take the enemy's guns out of action. Such engines were in fact present. Doubtless, they had been flown hither from the central bastion of Darova. There were two kinds of these horseless wagons. The most numerous sort was light and open, made of thin steel, holding 4 soldiers and a couple of rapid-fire weapons. They ran immensely fast and agile, like water beetles on 4 wheels. As I saw them whip and scream about, bouncing at 100 miles an hour over broken terrain, I understood their purpose: to be so difficult to hit that most of them could work up to the very bombards of the foe. However, these small cars hung back, covering the Wurzgor infantry. The first line of actual attack was the heavy armored vehicles. These moved but slowly for a powered machine, no faster than a horse could gallop. This was because of their size, big as a peasant's cottage, and the thick steel plating which could withstand all but a direct shell burst. With bombards projecting from their turrets, with their roaring and dust, they were like unto dragons. I counted more than 20, massive, imperious, grinding forward on treads in a wide line. Where they had passed, grass and earth were smashed into stone-hard ruts. I am told that one of our gunners, who had learned how to use the wheeled cannon which threw explosive shells, broke ranks and dashed for such a weapon. Sir Roger himself, now armed cap a pie, rode up, knocked him asprawl with his lance. "Hold on there," rapped the Baron. "What are you about?" "To shoot, sire," gasped the shoulder. "Let's fire at 'em, ere they break over our wall, and—" "If I didn't think our good yew bows could deal with such an overgrown snail, I'd have you priming yon tube," said my lord. "But as it is, back to your pike." It had a salutary effect on the badly shaken spearmen, who stood with weapons grounded to receive that frightful charge. Sir Roger saw no reason to explain that, judging from what had happened at Stularax, he dared not use explosives at such short range, lest he destroy us too. Of course, he should have realized that the Wurzgorics would have many kinds of shell of graded potency. But who can think of everything at once? As it was, the drivers of those moving fortresses must have been sorely puzzled that we did not fire on them, and wondered what we held in reserve. They found out when the first war wagon toppled into one of our covered pits. 2 more were similarly trapped ere it was understood that these were no ordinary obstacles. Surely the good saints had aided us. In our ignorance, we had dug holes broad and deep, which by themselves would not have been escape-proof for such powerful vehicles. But then we added great wooden stakes, almost by sheer habit, as if we expected to impale outsize horses. Some of these caught in the treads which girdled the wheels, and ere long those wheels were jammed tight with wood pulp. Another wagon evaded the pits, which were not contiguous. It approached the breastworks. A rapid-fire gun spat from it, seeking the range, and stitched small craters along our wall. "God send the right!" roared Sir Brian Fitzwilliam. His horse spurted from our lines, closely followed by half a dozen of the nearer cavalry. They galloped in a semicircle just beyond reach of the gun. The vehicle lumbered in pursuit, seeking to bring its smallest bore cannon to bear. Sir Brian got it headed the way he desired, winded his war horn, and galloped back to shelter as the wagon plunged into a hole. The war turtles drew back. In that long grass, and with our cunning camouflage, they had no way of knowing where the other traps were. And these were the only such machines on all Thraxion, not to be lightly hazarded. We English had trembled lest they continue. Only one would have had to get through to wipe us out. Even though his information about us, our powers, and our possible spaceborne reinforcements was scanty, I think Haruga should have ordered the heavy wagons onward. Indeed, the Wurzger tactics were deplorable in all respects. But remember that for a long time they had not fought seriously on the ground. Their conquest of backward planets was a mere battue. Their skirmishes with rival starfaring nations were mostly aerial. Thus, Haruga, discouraged by our pits, but heartened by our failure to use low-power shellfire, withdrew the great cars. Indeed, he sent the infantry and the light vehicles against us. His idea was plainly for them to find a path between our traps and mark it for the giant machines to follow. The blue soldiers came at a run, scarcely visible through the tall grass, divided into little squads. I myself, being placed far back, saw only the occasional flash of a helmet and the poles which they stuck up here and there to mark a safe channel for the heavy wagons. Yet I knew they numbered many thousands. My heart thudded within me, and my mouth longed for a beaker of ale. Ahead of the soldiers came racing the light cars. A few of them went into the pits, and at such speeds were horribly wrecked. But most sped in a straight line, straight into the stakes we had planted in the grass near our breastworks, in case of a cavalry charge. So fast were they traveling, the cars were almost as vulnerable to such a defense as horses would be. I saw one rise in the air, turn over, smash back to earth, and bounce twice ere it broke apart. I saw another impale itself, spout liquid fuel, and burst into flame. I saw a third swerve, skid, and crash into a fourth. Several more, escaping the abatis, ran over the caltrops we had scattered around. The iron spikes entered the soft rings encircling their wheels, and were not to be gotten out. A car so injured could at best limp feebly from the battle. Commands in the harsh Wurzger tongue must have rattled over the far speaker. The majority of the open cars, still unscathed, ceased to mill about. They drew into a loose but orderly formation and advanced at a walking pace. Snap went our catapults, and crash went our ballistae. Bolts, stones, and pots of burning oil hailed atrociously among the advancing vehicles. Not many were thus disabled, but their line wavered and slowed. Then our cavalry charged. A few of our horsemen died, caught in a storm of lead, but they had not far to gallop to reach the enemy. Also, the grass fires started by our oil pots confused Wurzger vision with their heavy smoke. I heard a clang and boom as lances burst against iron sides, then had no more chance to watch that struggle. I only know that the lancers failed to disable any car with their shafts. However, it startled the drivers so much that these often failed completely to defend themselves against what followed. Rearing horses brought down hooves to crumple the thin steel plates. A few quick swipes of axe, mace, or sword emptied a vehicle of its crew. Some of Sir Roger's men used handguns to good effect, or small, round shells which burst and scattered at jagged fragments when thrown after a pin was released. The Wurzgeriks had similar weapons, of course, but less determination to use them. The last cars fled in terror, hotly pursued by the English riders. "Come back, there!" bellowed Sir Roger at them. He shook the fresh lance given him by his esquire. "Come back, you caitiff rogues! Stand and deliver, you base-born heathen!" He must have been a splendid sight. Gleaming metal and fluttering plumage and blazoned shield upon the restless coal-black stallion. But the Wurzgeriks were not a knightly folk. They were more prudent and forethoughtful than we. It cost them dearly. Our horsemen must quickly retreat, for now the Blue Foot was close, firing their guns as they pulled into larger masses for the assault on our breastworks. Armor was no protection, only a bright target. Sir Roger bugled his men to follow him, and they scattered out onto the plain. The Wurzgeriks set up a defiant cheer and rushed. Across the seething confusion in our camp, I heard the archer captains howl their command. Then the gray goose flock went skyward with a noise as of mighty winds. It came down gruesomely among the Wurzgeriks. While the first arrow flight was still rising, the second was on its way. A shaft with so much force behind it pierces the body and comes out on the other side with its broad head all bloody. And now the crossbows, slower but still more powerful, began to mow down the nearest attackers. I think that during those last few moments of their charge, the Wurzgeriks must have lost half their folk. Nonetheless, dogged as almost as Englishmen, they ran on to our very wall. And here our common men-at-arms stood to receive them. The women fired and fired, pinning down a goodly part of the foe. Those who came so close that guns were useless must face axe, spear, billhook, mace, morning star, dagger, and broadsword. Despite their awesome losses, the Wurzgeriks still outnumbered our folk 2 or 3 to 1. Yet it was scarcely fair. They had no body armor. Their only weapon for such close-in fighting was a knife attached to the muzzle of the handgun to make a most awkward spear, or the gun itself clubbed. A few did carry pellet-firing sidearms, which caused us some casualties. But, as a rule, when John Blueface fired at hairy Englishmen, he missed even at point-blank range in all that turmoil. Before John could fire again, Harry had laid him open with a halberd. When our cavalry returned, striking the Wurzger infantry from the rear and hewing away, it was the end. The enemy broke and ran, trampling his own comrades in blind horror. The riders chased them with merry hunting calls. When they were far enough away, our longbows cut loose once more. Still, many escaped who must otherwise have been spitted on a lance, for Sir Roger saw the heavy wagons trundling vengefully back and retreated with his folk. By God's mercy, I was so occupied caring for the wounded fetched to me that I knew nothing of that moment when our leaders thought we were undone after all. For the Wurzger charge had not gone for naught. It had succeeded in showing the turtle cars how to avoid our pits. And now the iron giants came across a field turned into red mud, and naught we knew could stop them. Thomas Bullard's shoulders slumped where he sat mounted near the baronial pennon. Well, he sighed, we gave what was ours to give. Now who will ride out with me to show them how Englishmen can die? Sir Roger's weary face drew into grave lines. We've a harder task than that, friends, he said. We were right to hazard our lives on a chance of victory. Now that we see defeat upon us, we've no right to throw those lives away. We must live, as slaves if need be, so that our women and babes are not altogether alone on this hell world. God's bones, shouted Sir Brian Fitzwilliam. Are you gone craven? The Baron's nostrils flared. You heard me, he said. We stay here. And then, lo, it was as if God himself had come to deliver his poor sinful partisans. Brighter than lightning, a blue-white flash burst several miles off in the forest. So lurid was the radiance that those few who chanced to be looking in that direction were blind for hours afterward. No doubt a great many Wurzgeriks were thus incapacitated, since their army faced it. The roar that followed knocked riders from their saddles and men from their feet. A wind swept us all, furnace hot, and carried tents before it like blown rags. Then, as that shattering wrath departed, we saw a cloud of dust and smoke arise. Shaped like an evil mushroom, it towered almost to heaven. Minutes passed before it began to dissipate. Its upper clouds lingered for hours. The charging war cars ground to a halt. They knew, as we did not, what that burst signified. It was a shell of the ultimate potency. That destruction of matter which I cannot but feel to this day is an impious tampering with God's work. Though my archbishop has cited me scriptural texts to prove that any art is lawful if it be used for good purposes. This was not a very strong shell, as such weapons go. It was meant to annihilate half a mile circle, and produced comparatively little of those subtle poisons which accompany such explosions. And it had been fired distantly enough from the scene of action to harm no one. Yet it put the Wurzgeriks in a cruel dilemma. If they used a similar weapon to wipe out our camp, if they overran us by any means, they might expect a hail of death. For the hidden bombard would have no further reason to spare the area of Gantarath. Thus, they must suspend their assault upon us until they had found and dealt with this new enemy. Their war wagons lumbered back. Most of the aircraft they had in reserve lifted and scattered widely, searching for whoever had fired that shell. The chief implement of this search, which, as we knew from our own studies, a device embodying the same forces as are found in a lodestone, through powers which I do not understand and have no desire to understand, since the knowledge is unessential to salvation, if not smacking of the black arts. This device could smell out large metallic masses. A gun, big enough to fire a shell of the known potency, should have been discovered by any aircraft flitting within a mile of its hiding place. Yet no such gun could be located. After a tense hour, while we English watched and prayed on our walls, Sir Roger gusted a deep breath. "I don't want to seem ungrateful," he said, "but I do believe God's helped us through Sir Owain rather than directly. We ought to find his party somewhere out in the woods, even if those enemy flyers don't seem able to. Father Simon, you must know who the best poachers are in your parish." "Oh, my son," exclaimed the chaplain. Sir Roger grinned. "I ask for no secrets of the confessional. I'm only telling you to appoint a few, shall we say, skilled woodsmen, to sneak their way through the grass into yon forest. Have them locate Sir Owain, wherever he is, and order him to hold his fire till I send word. You needn't tell me who you appoint, Father." "In that case, my son, it shall be as you command." The priest drew me aside and asked me to give spiritual comfort to the injured and frightened as his locum tenens, while he led a small scout party into the forest. But my lord found another task for me. He and I ran, and an esquire rode out under a white banner towards the Wurzger camp. We assumed that the foe would have wit enough to understand our meaning, even if they did not use the same truce signal. And thus it was. Haruga himself drove out in an open car to meet us. His blue jowls looked shrunken, and his hands trembled. "I call upon you to yield," said the Baron. "Stop forcing me to destroy your poor benighted commoners. I pledge you'll all be treated fairly and allowed to write home for ransom money." "I yield to a barbarian like you?" croaked the Wurzger. "Just because you have some confounded detection-proof cannon? No." He paused. "But to get rid of you, I'll allow you to leave in the spaceships you've seized." "Sire," I gasped when I translated this, "have we indeed won escape?" "Hardly," Sir Roger answered. "We can't find our way back, remember? And as yet, we dare not ask for a skilled navigator to help us, or we'd reveal our weakness and be attacked again. Even if we did somehow win home, 'twould still leave this nest of devils free to plot a renewed assault on England. Nay, I fear that he who mounts a bear cannot soon dismount." So, with a heavy heart, I told the Blue Noble that we had come for more than some of his shoddy, old-fashioned spaceships, and if he did not surrender, we would be forced to devastate his land. Haruga snarled for reply and drove back. We also returned. Presently, Red John Hayward came from the forest with Father Simon's party, which he had encountered on his way to our camp. "We flew to that Stularak's castle openly, sire," he related. "We saw other sky boats, but none challenged us, taking us for a simple ship of their own. Still, we knew no forest sentries had let us land without some questions, so we put down in some woods a few miles from the keep. We set up our trebuchet and put one of those bursting shells in it. Sir Owain's idea was to lob a few to shake up their outer defenses. Then we'd slip closer afoot, leaving a crew to fire some more shells when we was near and break down their walls. We expected the garrison would be scurrying about in search of our engine, so we could slip in, kill whatever guards were left behind, and lift what we could carry from their arsenal, and return to our boat. At this point, since it is no longer used, I had best explain the trebuchet. It was the simplest, but in many ways the most effective siege engine. In principle, it was only a great lever, freely swinging on some fulcrum. A very long arm ended in a bucket for the missile, while the short arm bore a stone weight, often of several tons. This latter was raised by pulleys or a winch, while the bucket was loaded. Then the weight was released, and in falling it swung the long arm through a mighty arc. "I didn't think much of those shells we had," Red John went on. "Why, the things didn't weigh no more than 5 pounds. We'd trouble rigging like trebuchet to cast 'em only those few miles. And what could they do, I wondered, but burst with a pop? I've seen trebuchets used proper, laying siege to French cities. We'd throw boulders a ton or two, sometimes dead horses, over the walls. But, well, orders was orders. So I myself cocked the little shell like I'd been told how to, and we let fly. Whoom. The world blew up like. I had to admit, this was even better to throw nor a dead horse. Well, through the magnifying screens, we could see the castle was pretty much flattened. No use raiding it now. We lobbed a few more shells to make sure it were reduced proper. Nothing there now but a big, glassy pit. Sir Owain reckoned as we was carrying a weapon more useful nor any which we could have lifted, and I'd say he were right. So we landed in the woods some miles hence, and dragged the trebuchet forth and set it up again. That's what took us so long, my lord. When Sir Owain had seen from the air what was happening about that time, we fired a shell just to scare the enemy a bit. Now we're ready to pound 'em as much as you wish, sire. But the boat? Asked Sir Roger. The foe have metal sniffers. That's why they haven't found your trebuchet in the forest. It's made of wood. But surely they would discover your flying boat wherever you've hid it. Oh, that, sire, Red John grinned. Sir Owain's got our boat flitting up there amongst the others. Who's to tell the difference in yon swarm? Sir Roger whooped with laughter. You missed a glorious fight, he said, but you can light the balefire. Go back and tell your men to start shelling the enemy camp. We withdrew underground at the agreed-upon moment, as shown on captured Wurzger timepieces. Even so, we felt the earth shudder and heard the dull roaring as their ground installations and most of their ground machines were destroyed. A single shot was enough. The survivors thereof stormed in blind terror aboard one of the transport ships, abandoning much perfectly unharmed equipment. The lesser skycraft were even quicker to vanish, like blown sea scud, as the slow sunset began to burn in that direction we had wistfully named the West. England's leopards flew above England's victory.